All right, I think it's, let me see this. Yeah, I think it's the symbol for recording is, yeah, I think it's blinking there, the recording.
It warned me that we're recording. So
Okay, good, great. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Luis Pessoa, and this is the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. We get together once in a while to discuss all sorts of what we hope are interesting issues at the interface between neuroscience and conceptual philosophical considerations. And this is something that we've done informally, and we plan to continue. So if you have ideas and suggestions, please shoot me an email. So today I'm really, really excited because we're going to talk to Earl Miller, who is at MIT, Picower Professor of Neuroscience at MIT. And we're going to discuss all sorts of things about emergence, cognition, brain waves, subspaces, and lots of super interesting things that I think are happening in neuroscience at the moment. Before I give it to switch it to Earl, I would like to just briefly talk about a new society that I'm a little bit involved in as well, but it's a joint effort by lots of people. Do you see on your screen the slide that shows the Society for Neuroscience logo thing?
yeah, we do.
Great. Yeah. So this is a new society, Societies for Philosophy and Neuroscience, and you can check out philandneural.com. It's our website where it has some information. We've had, you might be aware that we've had a meeting, our first meeting this May, the beginning of May, for 3 days. It was at WashU. It was unbiased, but I think it was a great success with 100 or 200, I think between 100 and 200 people, lots of really interesting seminars. And we're planning to do this meeting every other year. So the next spearheaded by Danielle Williams, now at Purdue, our brave leader, and several other folks. But we are planning on doing this meeting every other year. So in 2027, there's going to be another one. And hopefully in between, we'll have other events as well that might be of interest to all of you. I also want to just briefly mention, see if this shows on the screen or not. Does the philosophy of neuroscience at the Gulf show on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so it's capturing my second screen. Yeah. So another event that is been organized for quite some years, actually. I think this is what the 8th version of the philosophy of neuroscience in Pensacola at the Gulf, that takes place usually the last week of September or 1st of October, organized by John Bickel and others, that really puts together philosophy of neuroscience. And it's a great venue right at the beach, very informal, a lot of fun. We discuss a lot of these issues. I've been to 2 of them, and I would highly recommend them. So I just want to switch right away to Earl's presentation. We've got a lot to discuss, really interesting stuff. So Earl, I think that if you share, you overtake me. I'm hoping.
I hope so.
All right. Otherwise, we'll figure this out.
That should be it. And now I should be able to start my slide presentation. Sure. You should see Pavlov's dogs there.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
And now you should see my slides.
Yes, we do. All right. Okay.
Just start. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. My name is Earl Miller, and I will just jump right in about cognition emerging from neural dynamics. So let's start right at the top and talk about consciousness. Many biological theories of consciousness have one thing in common: the formation of large mesoscale networks or ensembles that stretch across large expanses of cortex. And this makes sense because conscious experience is a unified whole. Right now you're experiencing sights, sounds, memories, meanings for the words I'm saying, and this is all sewn together somehow into a unified whole. So that begs the question of how does the brain organize hundreds of millions of neurons into large-scale networks? How does the brain produce this unified whole? And this isn't just a question of consciousness. This is the central question of cognition. I've been studying executive brain functions for 30 years, and this is the main question we're asking. How does the brain self-organize itself to produce organized thought, functions, and action? Now, the traditional view of brain function, the one I learned when I was a graduate student, is that the brain computes and stores information by modifying network connections, changing synaptic weights. This is how AI is modeled after this. It's all changing connections. So large language models do. And the idea was that neurons are highly specialized with electrical impulsive spikes and synapses loosely analogous to ones and zeros in the logic gates in digital systems. So this is the way we thought about the brain. We thought every neuron, we used to think every neuron was specialized for one specific function, and brains work by changing connections as if it's some elaborate telegraph system that we could rewire on the fly. And this is kind of captured, and this is a figure from Nikos Logothetis, and he wasn't using it to make this point, but it's a nice figure, is that this is the traditional feed-forward way of thinking about brain processing that we inherit from Hubel and Wiesel, is that you have these edge detectors in primary visual cortex that detect little line segments, then they converge on another layer of processing which piece together that information into longer edge detectors, and then the edge detectors converge onto things and they make corner detectors, then the corner detectors converge on other things, et cetera, and so on, and eventually you get complex shapes, and there's a lot of neurons in your brain, so you combine through all this like feed-forward processing, and eventually you get peace, love, and understanding. That was the general idea. However, a critical insight made over the past 25 years or so has called this view into question. And that is many neurons are multifunctional. They don't have single functions. Just to remind you, the traditional view of neural coding that I just mentioned is they have neurons that are specialized. They detect single features like form, color, or motion, like red, round, and moving to the right. Or they detect simple linear combinations of a few things. They combine red rolling and ball into red rolling ball. That's for traditional view. But more complex studies with complex behavioral designs revealed that many neurons in cortex, in fact, like the majority of neurons in cortex, are multifunctional mixed selectivity neurons. And these neurons show nonlinear combinations of information, not simple combinations like red rolling and ball, and they combine many features in many different combinations. Importantly, they don't seem to have any single combinatory principle or function. However, they don't seem to be single function. They seem to be multifunctional. And as such, they are multifunctional. They adapt their signaling to play different roles in different contexts, kind of like a utility player in a baseball team. They change their role from moment to moment, from context to context. And what my colleagues have shown, is that these mixed selectivity neurons are critical for high-level cognition. And again, just to summarize briefly, this is work from Stefano Fusi, Mattia Rigatti at Columbia University, working with data provided by my former graduate student, Melissa Warden. And they showed computationally that these mixed selectivity neurons, these multifunctional neurons, are necessary for high-level cognition. They combine a wide range of information. They make high-dimensional space that allows the brain to solve more complex problems. They increase storage capacity because instead of memories being stored in a few specialized neurons, they're distributed across many neurons, effectively making the storage capacity of the brain effectively unlimited. And finally, because for all these reasons, they show fast learning and cognitive flexibility because they can combine different things in different combinations in this highly dimensional space. However, mixed selectivity brings up a big problem for the previous paradigm on how we view the brain. It suggests that cortex is not a simple network that combines things in a linear way that makes sense. Cortex instead is a multitude of overlapping networks sharing many synaptic connections. In other words, the neurons participate in different networks, different ensembles, and they change their connectivity, they change their network participation from moment to moment depending on the current functional demands. Now, what this says to me is that connectivity alone, synaptic connectivity, can't be the whole story. The whole model that AI is based on, this can't be the whole story for how brains work. And this is because complex goal-directed behavior, as I've alluded to already, requires large-scale coordination of millions of neurons. Right now, hopefully you're paying attention to me, thinking about what I'm saying. There's a gazillion neurons in your cortex that are all coordinating their processing in order to pay attention to me and process the information in a coordinated way. And our brains are self-organized. This is the key point. We don't just react to the environment like an amoeba swimming towards food sources or swimming away from light. We act on the environment. We organize our own thoughts and actions around both short and long-term goals. Our brains are constantly creating a narrative, and we check in with the outside world. And that's in sharp contrast to AI that really only responds to inputs and has none of this inner agency. And finally, flexibility. High-level cognition, if you had to summarize high-level cognition in one word, it would be flexibility. We have the ability to respond differently in different contexts and rapidly change what we're doing from moment to moment, depending on what we're hearing, what's changing in a complex environment. And what this all says to me is that it seems impossibly complex for any sort of executive control system that's going to produce this large scale coordination of millions of neurons. It seems impossible to exert that kind of control on the level of individual synaptic connectivity. I mean, how do you produce this organization? Do you somehow organize a gazillion synapses on a gazillion neurons simultaneously? It just seems, like way too complex, way computationally intractable. And also, something that we don't talk about that often as a field is that spiking synaptic transmission is actually pretty slow. So if I flash a visual stimulus on a screen, it takes about 100, 120 milliseconds for the spikes to start peaking showing a phasic peak response in my prefrontal cortex. 100 milliseconds is an eternity when it comes to neural computation. So what's the solution? Well, we believe the solution is something the brain, most obvious thing the brain does. In fact, it's the first signal we ever recorded from the brain. That is, brains produce oscillating electric fields. You see us here on the bottom of the screen here. If I can show my cursor here, here is the EEG recordings that we're all familiar with. These squiggly lines reflect synchronized oscillatory activity among large numbers of neurons. And these brain waves, these oscillations, are an emergent property. They're not explainable at the level of single neurons. So here you see a crowd doing the wave. You see the wave moving from right to left across the crowd. You can't detect this wave by studying the people one at a time. You can't detect the wave by knowing where they're sitting, what their interactions will be, or you can't detect the wave just by knowing the individual neurons and the connectome. You only could see the wave by studying them all simultaneously. Then this property emerges that you can't see at the level of the individual parts. That's what an emergent property is. But importantly, oscillations are organization. Electrical networks will naturally begin to oscillate. My guess is that very early in evolution, when networks got complex enough, and when it comes to complex enough, we're not talking about that complex. I mean, Drosophila nervous systems oscillate. When nervous systems began to form, they naturally began oscillating. Well, oscillations are an internal organization. Now the network is not just responding to the outside world, it's generating its own rhythms that are producing its own internal organization. Now that just naturally oscillating is a dumb organization, but evolution could evolve mechanisms to take advantage of this natural organization by finding mechanisms that push around the oscillations, that control the oscillations. And then we have a system that can produce control at this emergent functional level. And importantly, wave dynamics make control easier, way easier than trying to exert executive control on the level of a gazillion synapses. Wave functions are computationally tractable. In fact, the wave functions are simple. Once you know a wave function, you know the wave's properties, you know its effects in the future and at a distance from a simple function. There's probably a reason why at the quantum level things work things are made up of waves, because it's a computationally tractable way of computing the universe. And importantly, electric field influences, these electric influences that the oscillations produce, spread around the brain 5,000 times faster than spiking a synaptic transmission, effectively spreading influences nearly instantaneously. That sounds like a pretty good mechanism for exerting large-scale control of the brain. And also, there's something called representational drift. Individual neurons are fickle, noisy, and unreliable. Anybody who records from cortex will tell you, in primary visual cortex or primary motor cortex, you could drive neurons pretty steadily when there's an input or a motor output. But the rest of cortex, neurons don't fire that often. They give a little burst of firing, then they're quiet for a while, then they're a little burst of firing, then they're quiet for a while. Individual neurons really don't spike all that often. They come and go. It's as if the cortex is a giant orchestra playing the song being the function, and individual members of the orchestra, individual neurons, are playing a little snippet of the song, then they're quiet, then they play another snippet of the song, then they're quiet for a while, then they'll come in later and play another snippet of the song. So if you want to exert executive control over the cortex, over the orchestra, you don't want to do it at the level of individual neurons and individual synapses, because not only is it computationally intractable, but individual neurons are not reliable. They're not. You want to act on the level of the emergent level, where the brain self-organizes, not at the neuron level. So work by my colleague Demetrios Panosis at University College London and I, we've done work showing that if you look at local field potentials, electric fields essentially, you can actually read the contents of working memory from electric fields without even using spikes. So here's an example. These are recordings from this electrode recordings. Electric fields on the y-axis. On the z-axis here is electrode location. This is an array of electrodes. This time on the x-axis. And I'm not really illustrating anything here. It's just a sort of cartoon to show that we can actually measure. We had an animal hold one of 4 or 5 pictures in working memory, and we could actually decode the contents of working memory from the local field potentials and electric fields, ignoring the single neurons. And not only can you read the information from the brain at the level of electric fields, when you do, there's no representational drift. There's none of this fickleness, none of this signals coming and going. It's a pure, steady information signal. So that's useful, but it's not just useful for studying the brain. In fact, my rule of thumb is that if we can make sense out of something with our electrodes, evolution probably found a way to exploit it. And sure enough, electrical fields aren't just reflecting neurons, reflecting neural activity. Electric fields have a causative influence in the brain, something called ephaptic coupling. Neurons spiking generates fluctuation in the surrounding electric fields, and the electric fields fluctuate the membrane potentials of individual neurons, and that gets them closer and farther away from the spiking threshold. And when that changes that environment, that affects the spiking activity. It's a bidirectional two-way influence. Spiking creates the fluctuations, creates the oscillations, then the oscillations turn around, take over, and sculpt the spiking. There's literally thousands of papers on ephaptic coupling. I encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested. So the way we think about it is that think of neural spiking as kind of like the start. Spiking is kind of like buzzing your lips into the mouthpiece of a trumpet. The notes start there, but the spiking creates resonance patterns in the, like buzzing your lips in the mouthpiece of a trumpet creates resonance patterns in the trumpet's body. Spiking creates resonance patterns, oscillations in the electrical fields of the brain. So the spiking is crucial. Everything starts there, and the spiking will reflect the underlying, information baked into networks through synaptic connectivity. But once that buzzing starts, it creates these resonance patterns where the notes really and the functions really form. Okay. And Demetrios and I have also proposed a hypothesis called cytoelectric coupling. I've been just talking about how these electric fields electrical influences can organize the brain on this large scale, on this mesoscale level. Well, we think it can also influence the brain, and we wrote a review proposing this on the micro scale level. That if you ever seen a video of you place grains of sand on a speaker and then play a note, the sand will organize itself into shapes like this. Well, we think that's what electric fields are also doing. These oscillations are actually restructuring, shifting around the structural proteins on the micro level of the brain. And what that does is it fine-tunes the networks to oscillate more efficiently. And evolution, biology is all about energy efficiency. So it's kind of like fine-tuning networks, kind of like tuning up a guitar string to respond optimally to stimulation. And if you're fine-tuning the networks to oscillate more efficiently, if the networks are carrying information in the oscillations, which they are, we've shown that, that means that it's a way for the information in the brain to actually restructure the brain on the micro scale levels. So not only producing large mesoscale organization, but restructuring the brain on the micro level as well. I submit to you one of the first true molecules to mind theories. And we've marshaled quite a bit of evidence over the past 10, 15 years or so, showing that different frequency brain waves have different functions in a general way. The bottom-up content of sensory processing seems to be carried by spiking activity riding on bursts of gamma that feed forward from sensory cortex up to frontal cortex. Then in turn, the frontal cortex, the executive cortex, sends back feedback signals traveling on alpha beta, lower frequency waves, that suppresses, it acts like has a suppressant effect on the bottom up gamma spiking. This allows it to organize and filter sensory inputs and control motor outputs. So the way to think about this is 2 years ago, we published a paper with Michael Lundquist. Michael Lundquist published a paper with us proposing a theory of spatial computing, and the idea here with spatial computing is that top-down control is kind of like these alpha beta signals are kind of like they're an inhibitory signal that produce a stencil that tells the cortex what shouldn't become activated, and then the bottom-up content carried by spikes and gamma is excitatory, and that's the spray paint that sprays through the alpha beta stencil to produce the patterns of activation that organize cortex. So the idea is that network negative space is a coding dimension. This negative network space, this top-down inhibitory alpha beta stencil, is a control dimension by providing this negative network space, kind of like a photographic negative. And the brain uses spatial patterns of neural activity coordinated by these suppressive alpha beta rhythms to control cortical network activity. And in the paper that Louise mentioned for the salon, we discuss in that paper how this can be used to explain this process of multifunctional mixed selectivity neurons. And I also point out that separating content from control solves a fundamental problem in current network models of the brain. In current network models, both the storage of information is in the network connections, and also the computations in the network connections. So if I train a standard neural network to do a working memory task with 4 pictures, and then I throw away those 4 pictures, I want to have the network apply it to 3 to 4 brand new pictures, the network needs to be retrained a little bit to accommodate the new sensory information. Because the information about the content, the pictures, are embedded in the same networks where the control, where the working memory functions are embedded. That means if you change one, you change the other. But this model separates content in one frequency domain, gamma, from the control in the alpha beta domain. And by separating these things into 2 frequency domains, they don't interfere with one another. You can have a network that can instantly generalize. You train a network to do a working memory task with 4 pictures, it can instantly generalize to 4 brand new pictures, just like our brains can. And finally, almost finally, there's another dimension by which these electrical fields exert influences, and that is by traveling waves. So now let's leave electrical fields aside for the moment and go back to spiking of single neurons. And what you see here is something called subspace coding. This is a measure of the shared variance of spiking activity from individual neurons. So let me explain what this means. Let's say I record the spiking activity of 1,000 neurons simultaneously. I can explain how that pattern of spiking activity by a 1,000-dimensional space. That's self-evident. But now we ask, how many dimensions do I actually need to explain how these 1,000 neurons, the spiking patterns in these 1,000 neurons? And the answer is you can explain most of the variance in just 3 dimensions. 3 dimensions. So there's a lot of dimensionality reduction going on in cortex. And what that means, if I can take 1,000 neurons and explain their spiking activity in just 3 dimensions, that means neural activity in cortex isn't like a complex insects buzzing in the summer sky. It's like a murmuration of birds. Cortical spiking is highly coordinated, like birds flocking in the sky together. So let me unpack what's going on in this graph here. What we see here is a representation of subspace coding from 150 or so neurons recorded from the prefrontal cortex simultaneously. And each of the 4 colored lines is a different trial where the monkey is holding a different picture in working memory. And what you see is separation in space between the 4 lines, which means that the prefrontal cortex is carrying information about the 4 pictures. But what's happening at time 0, when the video starts, is in the middle of the working memory delay, we're trying to distract the animal by showing a visual distractor, trying to knock the animal off its game. And what happens is the network responds to this distraction. You see it gets knocked out of its space where it was before by the disturbance. And then some mechanisms in the brain exist that steer cortical spiking back around to where it was before the disturbance. So this circling is the recovery process. It's the cortex recovering from that distraction so it can carry on with the task. So the question is, how does the brain produce this kind of flexible organization? Here's this representation of the spiking, reflecting 4 different working memories. We disturb it, and there's this coordinated murmuration of birds that then steers the flock of birds, the neurons, back to where it was before. How does the brain do this? Well, we have shown in a recent paper that there's a direct correspondence between this rotation, this recovery from distraction, this rotation in neural subspace, spiking activity, and electrical fields rotating around the surface of cortex. So here's recordings from the surface of the cortex from the same place where we recorded these neurons. And what these are just electrical voltage measures. And this is raw data, totally unprocessed. And you can see there's this rotating wave that's rotating counterclockwise across the surface of cortex, much like we're seeing this counterclockwise rotation in subspace. So we found direct correspondence between subspace coding and spiking and traveling waves of electric fields in the cortex. Now let me unpack this a little more. What we're finding here is the subspace coding is not a physical rotation. It's a representation of the shared variance of spiking activity from neurons. It's a mathematical construction of neural computation. There's no reason in principle why rotation in this mathematical subspace of spiking should correspond to an actual physical rotation across the surface of cortex. But it does, and that can't be a coincidence. We think it suggests that the cortex may function as an analog computer, performing computations with waves. So it's not just that the waves are controlling spiking activity, the waves are actually doing computation. So what does that mean? What this means is analog computation is computation using continuously changing physical variables like brain waves. And here's a simple example of 2 sine waves. You slide them past one another. When the sine waves line up, you get to see this growing of the mix of the 2. You see they add together to produce a larger sine wave. Then as they slide apart from one another, the mix gets smaller and smaller until it disappears when they're completely out of phase. So what these 2 sine waves are doing are simple addition and subtraction. It's like a like a one-dimensional slide rule, right? Well, you can do this with waves, not just for simple addition and subtraction. You can actually use, the brain is doing this not in 1 dimension, the brain is doing this in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions because there's different cortical layers. So the brain is producing these wave patterns in 3 dimensions and across different frequencies, not just 2 identical sine waves. That's a lot of space for doing a lot of computation. And in fact, a bit of MIT history here, wave patterns can model and perform complex computations. Way back in 1927, Vannevar Bush, the person who founded our current system for, well, our used to be current system for funding science, before that claim to fame, he built, across the street from where I am here at MIT, he built an analog differential analyzer that used wheels and disks to solve 18 variable differential equations. Very complex math using wheels and disks. And when they had a certain problem they want to solve, they set up the wheels and disks in a certain way. And then when another problem came along, they had to solve another differential equation. They just moved the wheels and disks around to set up a different equation, then ran that off. Well, wheels and disks are the same thing as oscillating electrical waves, only electrical waves are far more flexible. So, in short, analog computing is information rich. Digital computing uses ones and zeros breaks down the world into just ones and zeros. Analog computing uses continuous signals. So you get ones and zeros and everything in between. So it's very information rich. It's also parallel. As I mentioned with Vannevar Bush, you can model equations by setting up how the waves are going to come together, the geometry of how the waves come together. That models an equation. All the different parts of the wave are carrying all the variables in the equation. So when the waves interact, all the variables are computed simultaneously. You get true parallel computing. You solve the entire problem in just one shot. Whereas digital computing is inherently sequential, and that's incredibly energy inefficient. In fact, analog systems are vastly more computational energy efficient than digital systems. And when I say vastly, I mean vastly, 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 vastly. They're building nuclear power plants and hydroelectric plants to power AI, and AI ain't that smart. I mean, one human brain is smarter than the smartest AI system, and the brain runs on only 20 watts of power. Now, evolution does not solve problems by throwing lots of energy at it. In fact, a pretty good definition of life is local reverses in entropy using as little energy as possible. And the fact that AI consumes enormous amounts of energy to do things that capacities that fall far short of the human brain, while the human brain, far more capable, runs on only just 20 watts, tells you that the brain is doing something fundamentally different from AI models, and that's fundamentally different from the traditional way the way we think about neural computation. So I want to think of this as cortex is kind of like a hybrid system. The connections in cortex, the synapses, the changes in synaptic weights, that's the cortex storing information. And that stored information produces intricate wave patterns when the neurons start spiking. But then the waves actually perform the computation using analog computing. So take-home messages are brainwave patterns, are patterns of excitability and inhibition. Don't forget these brainwave patterns aren't just abstract waves. They are actually patterns of excitation and inhibition. High excitation, low excitation, high energy, low energy. That's what waves are. And that's what the cortex runs on, patterns of excitation and inhibition. Analog computing generates these patterns of excitation and inhibition in a principled way. When the waves come together, they produce an output that can be predictable by these analog computations. And let me point out that these traveling waves in cortex aren't like ping pong balls bouncing around at random. They are highly organized and move in a highly organized fashion, much like that crowd in the sports arena doing the wave. And that's the raw materials for analog computation. Traveling waves that are organized. That's what analog computation uses. And this, by the way, this isn't conjecture. You can do computation with this. Physicists have done computation with this. They've done computation with optical, with light waves, done computation with electric waves. I was at a DARPA meeting a few weeks ago where they were talking about using oscillations in microprocessing chips to computation to make the chips more efficient. So, analog computation isn't an esoteric hypothetical thing. People are using it and it actually happens. In fact, analog computing, first analog computer was really an astrolab from like 1200 BC. So digital computing is more of a detour than in the long history of computation. And these principled patterns that analog computation produces provides the flexible organization, underlies the spiking activity, produces the kind of organization that underlies cognition. And just to tie it back to the top, we believe that consciousness arises when the analog computations, these brainwave patterns that the analog computations produce, when the result of the computations produces wave patterns that are large and organized enough to unify cortical processing, and that produces the unified experience of consciousness. So that's it. I thank you. I'm happy to now take questions, and I also want to thank all the members of my laboratory, the ones who really do all the hard work while I get to chat with you guys. Okay.
Awesome. That was there was a lot there. So what I would suggest is, so our goal is to spend the next 30, 45, 60 minutes, depending on how long Earl can stick around, discussing as much as possible the content of the talk. So if you have questions, then raise your hand, and I'll try to keep the order of the questions. But I encourage you, yeah. So I encourage you to raise your hand, and if you don't feel comfortable, maybe you can put your question on the chat, and I'll try to monitor that as well. But I'm going to try to keep track of the hands first. I did not catch who was first there. I guess it says that Carolyn was the first. I guess it's a new feature, it seems, at least my Zoom. So Carolyn, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I was fast.
Thanks.
I love your work, Earl, and this was a great presentation, so thank you. I guess my question, because I wasn't aware actually of your view of consciousness, so that is new to me. And I was curious because a lot of your presentation you talked about the brain in a way where it seems like there's an overarching goal, and that's what's doing the kind of control work. But I was curious as you were speaking about how you see the brain working when there are competing goals. And then
Yeah.
that is relevant for the way you see consciousness too, because um, I take it that you would want to separate a case where we're consciously driven by multiple different goals or two goals. Maybe we're torn between two goals and we're not sure which way we want to direct our attention, but we're conscious, so it's not unified,
Mhm.
but still conscious. And a case where our brain is disunified in a way where it doesn't reach consciousness. And I'm just curious about how you think about disunities that are still conscious and how they're resolved and what
Yeah.
does the resolving.
Oh, fan, those $1 million questions right there. Those are the real, that's where it's all going to go eventually. But the short answer is that if I had all the answers now, we wouldn't be having this salon. Um, but I think of like, how does the, what produces the agency? Okay. What is producing this top-down control? That's really the question. I think it's just the matter of representing information. I mean, if I pay attention to a clock on the wall, my visual cortex becomes dominated by the representation of that clock on the wall. And the way the control is produced, the way I think about it, is that we have information stored in our brain's networks through the synaptic connection stuff about goals and means to achieve them. And that gets activated and takes over cortex, much like takes over frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex sends these influences. And that's really no different in the end from a visual stimulus, a clock, taking over your visual cortex. It's your frontal cortex being taken over by another type of information about goals and means. So that information about the goals and stuff is represented in the pattern of network changes through learning, and then the spiking patterns produce these wave patterns that reflect those goals and means, and they interact to produce the next steps. So that's the way in which I think agency comes about. And importantly, I want to kind of emphasize this, is that the advantage of this view is that essentially what brain function is then, it's patterns begetting patterns begetting patterns. That's what all brain function is. And if we accept that, now we've, for the first time, perhaps, we've gotten rid of the homunculus from any discussion of the mind. And why most neuroscientists will say, oh, because there's nothing like a homunculus, a little person directing things in the brain. Nonetheless, we still kind of act as if there is, because we do things, reviewers ask for things like, well, can you do a nonlinear decoder and see if they can draw a threshold and see if there's a decision point? Well, yeah, we can. It's a useful test for showing there's actually information in our neural activity. But what in the brain is producing this decision threshold? There's nothing in the brain making that decision. But with this kind of like a idea of patterns producing patterns, you no longer need that. It's the patterns that matter, not anything decoding stuff downstream with this decision threshold. And I wish I had answers for how these different goals and stuff interact and compete, but I imagine they interact and compete just like the same way memory, stored information, interacts and competes when you try to activate two things that have common overlap. So that was a long way to answer your question, but I hope it gave you something.
Carolyn, do you want to rejoinder, or you want
If it's
to?
okay, I would just do a quick, so I hear you that like other people need to do work too. You can't solve all the problems on your own. Just if you were to give like a kind of hunch, or it sounds like from what you're saying that if you had two strong goals and the information stored in your network
Mhm.
that for whatever reason were like at odds. It sounds like what you're saying, that what would determine the outcome of that would just be the existing strength of the goals, that there would be no further thing that would determine which one would win.
Well, yeah, the existing strength of the goals, but also like the current. There's lot of things that will factor into it. Current motivational state. You know, what's the goal you're going after, and what need does it satisfy? Is that need a strong need right now versus another need? That kind of thing. And also, there's also the times when goals have to override things like prepotent responses, like you have a reflex, and then your goal, you start to activate it because it's a habitual response, like a prefrontal patient doesn't have prefrontal cortex damage. They grab a cup and start drinking out of it. And sometimes you have to, the goal will not just be competing with another goal, it'll compete with that's a kind of habitual thing to override it. So there's lots of competition between these neural representations.
All right, so let's circle to Kevin, please. Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Earl. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hey Kevin.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
So great talk. And all of the patterns driving patterns. I think that's all great. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the last thing though, which is almost a throwaway there about consciousness being this sort of unified
Mhm.
pattern of oscillations. I don't get a good sense of what that means in two ways. First of all, what's the contrast of what does a not unified pattern look like? Because you talked earlier about there being all sorts of multiplexed waves in different layers of the cortex, different
Yeah.
areas of the cortex, and so on. And then just the flip side of that is like, what's the contrast with the state of as opposed to consciousness? Is it
Sure.
like a state where you're not consciously aware of something? Is it a state where you're unconscious? Is it a state where things are happening subconsciously? I didn't get both
Sure.
sides of the contrast.
Well, these waves, brain waves, traveling waves, oscillations will happen in multiple scales, both locally and globally, right? They can happen on the fine scale, very locally. They can expand and include neighboring bits of cortex, and finally expand and include the whole cortex. That's the idea. So if I may use an analogy from the global workspace theory, think of like unconscious processing is you're in an audience waiting for the band to start playing, and there's a spattering of applause here and there. And that would be like local waves organizing themselves, these smattering of applauses. That's unconscious processing. It's organized locally, but it's not organized enough to produce this cortical unification. But then when these waves begin to add up and they produce, through analog computation, produce patterns that are more complicated. Finally they get to the point where they're organized across, where the patterns are organized across the entire cortex, that unifies cortical processing, and that's when consciousness comes in. So somewhere along that continuum will be either a zone or a border where consciousness begins to take over.
Okay, thanks. I'm still a little confused on what organized means and unified, because
Entanglement.
it's not synchronized, right? It's not that it's synchronized across, not like having a seizure, right?
No. So you guys know, you ever communication through coherence? That's the Pascal-Fries theory, and that's the idea is that if two brain areas synchronize
Oh
their
yes, okay,
oscillations,
yeah.
they can talk to one another.
Right.
That's using synchrony as a backbone of communication, and
Okay.
I think that's true to some degree, but I think there's a broader picture, and it should be organization through coherence.
Uh-huh.
These patterns of brainwave patterns produce patterns of excitation and inhibition. That's what they are. And when the patterns become organized, so that you get an output of a analog computational waves come there, produce this like pattern that can produce a wave pattern, an organized pattern of excitation and inhibition that somehow unifies all this cortical processing. That's where consciousness comes in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
So let me actually follow up on that, Earl. So I guess from that perspective, then there's no necessarily a sharp boundary between. So consciousness is something graded or qualitative that perhaps along several axes, right? So it's not something, there is an unconscious, conscious step function or something like that. What matters is the degree and the type of organization.
Yeah, and the problem we're going to run into here is we don't have a good definition of consciousness. I mean, we talk about limited capacity processing as identifying a conscious process like working memory, but we don't really have a good definition. Most of our definitions of consciousness, at least from a practical standpoint, are like, do you respond to stimulation? And that's going to be that will end up being largely a thresholding effect, but it may not reflect an actual real threshold, right?
Right, but your hunch is more graded, or your hunch is
My
more.
hunch is more graded, although there might be a nonlinear gradient. So
Right.
you know,
Right, there's some
but it's not
nonlinearities.
not a smooth gradient, but a gradient, and then suddenly you flip, like
Yeah, there might.
that kind of
Okay,
thing.
sure.
Yeah, and also, I want to propose something too for when it comes to consciousness, and Stuart's probably going to get upset about this, and that is, for studying consciousness. I think it's better to come up with we have to come up with a good, anything we study, we got to have a good definition of, right? Now, a lot of things may be conscious, maybe the universe is conscious, maybe maybe Drosophila are conscious, maybe your thermostat's conscious. It could be you enough organization, you get consciousness. But I think if we're going to study, if we're going to science the shit out of consciousness, I may quote Matt Damon, we have to come up with a good working definition of consciousness. And I think a good working definition of consciousness in this case, just for the sake of studying, is human-like consciousness. Because if AI has consciousness, or if an octopus has consciousness, if I could experience what their consciousness is like, it would be nothing like I would recognize as being consciousness like mine. I mean, AI is only responding to inputs, right? So that consciousness can be very different from the internal narrative that or an octopus has, its nervous system is distributed across its arms. It has distributed right in the central nervous system. Maybe it's
Right.
conscious, but it will be a very different form of consciousness, and one that I won't recognize as consciousness. So I think this is just from a purely practical standpoint, a good working definition would be human-like consciousness.
Okay, all right. So Alessandra.
Earl,
Yeah.
since you mentioned me,
Yeah, I knew you'd come up, Stuart.
first of all those organisms have microtubules, so they could be conscious just at a slower frequency. But my question was, how do you explain cognition in a paramecium, which swims around, finds food, finds a mate, has sex, and can learn? It doesn't have any synapses, doesn't have any waves. Well, it may have waves over the surface, but they're not communicating with any others.
Oh,
And it
simple.
uses its microtubules for cognition. So why wouldn't neurons use theirs for memory and everything else?
Well, the idea of using microtubules for cognition is a hypothesis, Stuart. But
Well, how do paramecium swim?
that's not cognition, Stuart. Swimming around, a thermostat reacting to changes in temperature is not cognition. Cognition is flexibility. Cognition is context-dependent behavior. I can change what I do from moment to moment depending on the situation I'm in, changing goals, changing situations. Cognition is flexibility. A paramecium is not flexible.
Well, it avoids obstacles. It finds food. It finds a mate, and it has sex.
Those are simple thermostat-like reactions. They're not what I would call cognition.
Well, why would it even do that if it didn't have consciousness? Why would it do anyething?
Why
would any organism
does my
do anything?
thermostat control the temperature in my house? Is it conscious?
Because somebody made it that way.
Well, evolution made the paramecium that way.
Well, why did life start before feelings? There are
Okay,
no-
okay, Stuart.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
We don't have
Thank
to
you,
go
Earl.
all the way to
Goodbye.
the beginning of the universe and
Yeah.
meaning of it all.
Well, let's go
But
back to
I
the Big
actually-
Bang.
I mean,
I wanna-
microtubules weren't. Come on, man. Okay, goodbye. Thank you, Earl.
Thank you, Stuart. Always nice.
All right, I'm gonna. So, Alessandra, forgive me for a second because I want to follow up a little bit on a tiny bit linked to what Stuart was saying in the following sense. So, one way that I look at this proposal, it's fascinating, but correct me if I'm wrong. It feels very cortical centric in the sense of the organization, the spatial temporal organization that is very natural in a cortex, right? In a cortical organization.
Yep.
So how do you view, even even in primates, how do you view the sort of the vertical direction? But even if we go more broadly, how do we go about other vertebrate taxonomic groups? And what are the implications about that, in the sense that if they have a cortex, a pallium sort of organized in some fashion that is related to what we have in mammals, is sufficiently different that I was wondering how
Yeah.
if you ever cross that those kinds of ideas have ever crossed your mind, how to expand or account for those other kinds of organizations.
Yeah, Louise, you are 100% totally correct, and I sort of hedge my bets here by saying, oh, this is happening in cortex. So someone could doesn't come along and say, oh, well, it's not happening in my brainstem area. I think the brain in general does that analog computation, and even simple nervous systems do. So I didn't mean to imply it's just a cortex thing. Maybe I was hedging my bets a little bit, And you're absolutely right. You cannot understand cortex without understanding subcortex. Cortex is like subcortex 2.0. We had everything that cortex does. We had simple functions in our subcortex before we evolved the cortex. Our cortex evolved to take those simple functions and elaborate them in a more complex anatomical structure, and by using different mechanisms, elaborate on their function. So you're absolutely right that that the cortex does not work alone. It's an extension of the subcortex, and we got to understand them vertically. And indeed, these oscillations, a lot of coordination in the traveling wave and stuff across the cortex, that's all going to be mediated by things like the thalamus, which is going to play a very, very crucial role because the cortex has these recurrent connections to the thalamus. Then the basal ganglia acts on the thalamus and helps organize that. So yes, you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to imply this is all just cortex and everything else. It's just sort of propping up the cortex or keeping it warm or something.
And so folks, we're going to a second segment here, and just to mark where we are. And while we wait for Alessandra, Kevin is going to ask a question. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, that's cheeky of me to ask, but Earl, it was just about the question of whether you see or can see these kinds of waves in neural structures that don't have this parallel organization of dendrites, which is great for producing electrical fields and synchronized sort of waves. So in different nuclei of the brain or in other kinds of creatures that don't have that organization, can you? I understand you can get population patterns, but do you actually get synchronized waves that travel in the same kind of a way?
Don't know, because people who study the simple systems don't tend to look for these things. You got to do actually electrophysiology instead of like calcium imaging or whatnot. Like good friend of mine, Steve Flavelle, who's a professor here at MIT, he studies C. elegans. And the C. elegans, it's like 300 neurons, right? And he was giving this talk where he found out that there's two behaviors the worm, it's called worm for short, the worm is producing, which is either explore or exploit. If it's exploring, its body is wiggling around and moving around looking for food. And then when it finds food, it stays in place and starts eating the food. And these two behaviors are essentially, explore is the whole body producing these large amplitude oscillations, so it'll go wiggle away. And then exploit is the oscillations switch to high frequency and low amplitude, right? And Steve was giving this talk. He has these two serotonin receptors that flip the C. elegans from one mode to another. And then as he's presenting this work, I noticed that the C. elegans nervous system is a spiral going down the length of its body, a bunch of circles connected down the length of its body. And I told Steve, I'll bet you a night's worth of beers that if you look at what's going on, you'll see these two serotonin receptors are flipping the whole C. elegans into two different oscillatory states. And since the body is wiggling, it's got to be a traveling wave, because that's how you produce that kind of wiggling. And the nervous system seems set up to do that. So I'd say that very simple creatures can produce traveling waves. Apparently, I mean that's a
although
hypothesis.
Just to push back on that, you can create traveling waves through synapses as opposed to propagation of a field.
You can, but it's much easier and better to do it through electric fields. Electric fields can exert wider range influences. Single synapses doesn't require that kind of coordination that synaptic organization would require, organizing of traveling wave. Remember these waves, at least let's get back up to the not worms, but us. If these waves are producing cognition, they got to travel around in very flexible, organized ways. And again, how are you going to do? You're going to do that organization flexibly at the level of synapses. I don't see how that can happen, but with waves, you can do it. And another thing that's worth mentioning, especially in cortex, is cortical neurons don't spike that often. I did mention that earlier. But let's say, for the sake of argument of making up a number here, cortical neurons spike 20% of the time. And that may actually be conservative because they give little bursts of firing. The average spiking rate of a neuron in cortex is like 15 hertz, which is way below their capacity to spike, way below, like order of magnitude below their capacity to spike. So neurons in cortex are just spiking occasionally, giving small bursts of spiking, then they're quiet for a long time, and they're small bursts of spiking. So they're spiking maybe 20% of the time. Well, 100% of the time, their membrane potentials are fluctuating, spreading electrical influences. So if you think of brain function in terms of spiking, producing the waves, and the waves are doing little or not doing much, that's kind of the tail wagging the dog, isn't it? And I'll give you another little factoid. Something like 40% of the cells in your brain are astrocytes. Astrocytes do things like neurons do. They have electrical potentials, they have local field potentials, they oscillate, they spread electrical influences. Astrocytes do not spike. So now we have spiking is only happening in half the cells in your brain, and it's only happening 20% of the time. Whereas 100% of the time, 100% of the cells are spreading electrical influences. So spikes may get the ball rolling, but the waves are really what takes over. And I think if you think about it, the waves in terms of, well, it's being produced by spiking, literally tail wagging the dog here.
Thanks, and sorry for being cheeky and poking in.
No. It's always good to hear from you, Kevin.
I'll let Nick jump in there.
Actually, Karim has his hand
Sorry,
raised,
apologies.
before, so Karim, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the talk. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
Quick introduction. I'm a postdoc from the University of Bristol in the UK, and I'm about the field. So if I'm saying something not so smart, please let me know, okay? I'm trying to reconcile this wave theorem with something like place cells, right? So there is like cognition, like rats or mammals, or they can know their location. You can decode their location, decode it from place cells. So place is like a form of cognition for place.
Sorry, recorded
So
from what? I couldn't quite get that word.
Place
Place
cells.
Recorded from place cells.
Place cells.
Yeah.
Yeah. So place cells, like you can decode the location, the trajectory of movement. And so it's a form of cognition. Like it can know, it's very like particular to spatial location. So how do you reconcile this kind of localized or distributed like sparse coding with waves as a form of cognition? And
I don't think they need to be reconciled. I think spikes and field potentials and oscillate, they're all part of the same thing. It's like measuring different things in different ways, but they're all measuring the same thing in different ways. They're all really the same thing in the end. We're measuring the electrical environment of the brain, and spiking doesn't happen independent of the oscillations, and oscillation doesn't happen independent of the spiking. What I often hear sometimes I've heard from people over the years, and I've talked about this stuff, is, well, do you have any causative evidence, causative manipulations that show oscillations actually do something in brain function? Well, the answer is yes. There's lots of examples of that. But I often turn around and say, do you have any examples of spiking activity having a causative influence? Can you show me some? And they go, oh, well, you stimulate cortex and the animal's eye moves. And you stimulate here and the animal's decision changes. Well, the moment you introduce currents into the cortex, you're not just changing the spiking, you're also changing the field potentials and the oscillations. So there really are no, the evidence for oscillations playing a role in brain function, the evidence for spiking playing a role in brain function are on equal footing, really. The one is not a gold standard. But again, I think of this as not just, I think our example of the rotating waves in cortex and the rotations in subspace is an example of that. It's just two different ways of measuring the same function, and they really same thing, and they can't really be separated into spikes do this and waves do that. I would say spikes create the waves sculpt the spiking. They all work together into bi-directional influence. But given that waves are happening more often and more, in more places and more cells, probably, once the ball gets rolling and the waves happen, the waves are exerting the bulk of the influence, but they're exerting that downward influence on the spiking. So there's really no separating the two.
So maybe I can and I can ask it in a different way. But I get what you mean. Like are spikes like are the final form of cognition, and waves are like the influence, the whole wide influence, or the waves are the final form of cognition? Are like the
Yeah,
blessings are the final form of cognition,
I see. Yeah.
or waves are like the the thing that transmits this cognition to other areas to like interfere and influence.
Spikes are probably pretty important for the initial influx of spikes are pretty important in general. Spikes are fundamental, but you're going to see a lot of like spikes probably take up the bulk of the function and the initial input of sensory information into the brain, and also motor output. If you want to drive muscles, you start driving spiking. So yeah, the inputs. If you want to call cognition the something we can measure behavior, yeah, spikes are going to be really important. But everything that led to that pattern of spiking that's producing behavior is going to be influenced and I think computed by these wave patterns.
I see. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Nick, please.
Thank you. Super interesting talk. Thank you, Earl.
Thank you.
So it strikes me that if control is going to be done in this analog kind of dynamical regime, control is going to have to deal with like turbulent problems and is going to become like fiendishly difficult. But at the same time, we get a lot kind of for free. We get like compositionality, big things within small things.
Yeah.
And so maybe we need quite different flavors of model to deal with control in this situation. And maybe the problems are going to be, the challenges are going to be quite different from dealing with control in a spiking dominated paradigm. Do you have any insight into like how difficult it's going to be to deal with control in this analog way?
Well, I believe that it's much easier to deal with control in the analog way because, again, wave functions are simple and they produce organization on the mesoscale, and that's much simpler than trying to organize a system piece by piece. When you say, yeah, it's fiendishly difficult, well, fiendishly difficult is another way of saying, well, the brain is fiendishly difficult, so it's all going to be fiendishly difficult. And a system based on spiking alone is also going to be fiendishly difficult. That's just what the way brains are. But if you're going to exert control and you want to exert in a computationally tractable manner, yeah, they're both going to be fiendishly difficult problems that you're dealing with spikes or waves, but waves are much less fiendishly difficult than control on the spiking level.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of tend to agree. There's lots of nice things about it. But then there's problems of like compositionality and hierarchy, where small things can be affecting big things, and you can get kind of chaotic interactions and so on.
How does that differ from spiking?
I don't know that it's more difficult than spiking. I just think the problem will be the framing of the problem might be different, and the kind of models and the kind of algorithms we want to use to deal with it might be different.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that spiking should be easier, so this is too difficult. I'm more trying to get towards what will be the grand challenges in this paradigm.
Yep.
Versus a spiking paradigm.
Yeah, well, the grand challenges are the same for the spiking paradigm, is figuring out how this all works together in a fiendishly difficult system. But again, it strikes me that way, and this not strikes me. This is the truth is that wave functions are relatively simple functions, and therefore they're a more tractable way to produce. It may still be fiendishly difficult, but it's less fiendishly difficult than trying to organize it on the spiking level. So I'm not sure what to go for. Other than say, yeah, we're going to be busy for a very long time figuring out the brain. And you can produce these kind of like oscillations. You know, you can produce that kind of hierarchical control. I have a paper that we're working on with Lisa Feldman-Barrett where we're arguing that the entire brain is set up to do dimensionality reduction. And the way you get things like categorization is these top-down predictive signals that are not categories themselves, but kind of like pointers or essence or icons of the categories. When they flow down cortex and frontal cortex and they collide with the bottom-up waves, then they blow up and you get like filling in of a coloring in the coloring book or something. And we see that these feed forward and feedback signals operate in two frequency domains. So right there, there's an example of a hierarchy right there where you have the bottom up versus top down operating in two frequency domains. So there's some hint, something in the data that's telling us this happening. You can't see that functional top down, bottom up thing in the spiking because spikes look like spikes.
Thank you.
Sure.
But one thing is interesting and clear is that would the whole framework would really redirect and shift a lot of the questions and the agenda, as Nick was saying. You know, it basically redirects quite a lot of things. So
isn't that what science is all about?
No,
Hell with the past. The past is the past. We build on the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me see if I can get a couple of questions that are here on the chat. Some are a little longer, so I don't know. Can you get to the chat too, Earl?
Sure, yeah.
There's a question on icterectal discharges propagating waves. I don't know if you can take the question.
Which one is it?
So it's from EC. It's amazing talk. There's evidence from groups like Karim Zagul.
Oh, it's not the amazing talk part. Just kidding.
That interictal discharges propagate. Do you see that one?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So if you could describe the question and briefly the answer.
Groups like Karim Zagul that interictal discharges propagate as travel waves at their impact on cognitive function and work memory flips with timing. In your framework, where the transient beta gamma burst gate content, would you view these waves as perturbations of the same mechanism or distinct phenomenon? I could look more deeply at it, but it sounds like a very similar phenomenon to me. If the mechanism is similar, which LFP markers, phase, directionality, cross-frequency coupling, do you think would best predict facilitation versus disruption? I think, yeah, this comment from EC actually, is that you, Emmanuel? Is that a good question, because it frames an important point here, and that is we can't think about one aspect or one frequency doing one function. I mentioned that the top down and bottom up is a low frequency versus high frequency. There's reasons for physics why you'd want low frequencies to be the control and high frequencies to be the content, but that's just a general thing. When it comes down to very specific functions, we got to be careful not to equate specific, like this frequency band does this and this frequency band theta does this. It's like asking us, what does a spike do? A spike in visual cortex does one thing, and a spike in motor cortex is something else. And these different frequencies and these different phase relationships and these different oscillations will have different functions in different parts of the brain, just like spikes do in different parts of the brain. So the question is, what's their mechanistic impact, not what function they're doing. But yeah, everything that's mentioned here in this comment by EC, the cross-frequency coupling is important. You see higher frequencies nest inside lower frequencies. Your brain literally harmonizes with itself. And also things like phase relationships. We had published a paper just this last year showing that when you're anesthetized, when animals are anesthetized, the brain shifts into low frequencies. And that we sort of knew that already. We get this low frequency as if you're in deep sleep, so slow wave sleep. But one thing that anesthesia does that we don't think sleep does, and we haven't tested it yet, unfortunately, because we haven't done the data. But under anesthesia, your brain goes into these slow waves, like slow wave sleep, but the waves become misaligned. They become phase misaligned. They become sharply misaligned. And you can imagine misaligning waves is a pretty good way to break apart cortical communication, disrupt communication in cortex. So in that case, that's some evidence right there that the phase relationship itself has a direct functional relevance. So yeah, all of the above, you're going to see facilitation, disruption. You're going to see all sorts of functions, but it's going to depend on what the impact of that oscillation is, what the impact of that phase relationship is in different parts of the brain. It's more of a mechanistic than a functional question. So should I still be reading the?
I'm muting. I'm unmuted now. But one question that I want to make sure to get to, because it's part of their PhD dissertation.
Kevin, C. elegans neurons don't spike either. Thank you for that. That's yeah, good.
So Earl, one question that I want to get to here is by AD Atanas Stankov. Their microphone is not working well, but it's part of their PhD dissertation. So they're saying they want your take on ephaptic mechanisms coupling in cortex, subcortex, cerebellum.
Yeah.
What is their role in cognition? So I guess.
Well, I can't see much about early evolution in neural development. It's not my area of expertise. However, the role of ephaptic coupling, I mean, you see ephaptic coupling literally everywhere you look. There's examples of it in cortex, in olfactory bulb, in the cerebellum, where ongoing waves makes the spikes line up together, changes spike timing. So their role in cognition is more like the role of these waves is more than just a role in cognition. It's a role in brain function in general. And everybody knows that if you look at oscillating waves in cortex, you'll see spikes will phase lock to those waves. They just do that. But the thing is, I think the difference is that many people used to think, a lot more people used to think, and there's fewer and fewer every year, who think that, oh, that's just the spiking creating the waves, and the waves are just like the humming of the car engine. They're not really doing anything. It's just a manifestation of the spiking. And I think everything we know about electromagnetic theory, how neurons produce spikes by membrane potentials crossing a threshold, and by literally thousands of papers on ephaptic coupling show that's not the case. The oscillatory dynamics not only are having an influence, they must be having an influence. So it's more of a general question of how brains function rather than. So what's their role in cognition? It's an important role in cognition because they play an important role in brain function. I hope that helps.
I hope so too. Okay, so maybe last question here from the chat is, I guess it's again, it's from EC about LFPs. EC asks that aren't LFPs primarily influenced by postsynaptic currents? And yeah, so I don't know if you want to
Glad you brought up
there.
LFPs. So there's something called spike time independence plasticity. If two spikes happen in downstream neurons in a small time window, you get LTP. If they happen in the opposite, you get LTD, right? So it's a window of spike time independent plasticity. Traveling waves are a great way to do that. Okay, particularly, when I didn't mention anything, I mentioned there's these rotating waves. Rotating waves are actually a common theme in cortex, across cortex. Like something like half the waves or more are rotating or spiraling, and then you get some transverse waves. There's a lot of rotation going on. Well, there's some work from I don't remember who did the original work, but it was in a paper that Terry Sinowski wrote, where rotating traveling waves are a great way to produce spike time independent plasticity, because you have this wave moving across the cortex, right? And all along that arm of the wave, you get all these timing differences. That's varying parametrically along the sweep of the wave. Okay, and somewhere along that axis is going to be the window of spike time independent plasticity. So now if I want to induce LTP into a network, in a principled way, all I got to do is move around the center of that rotating wave, and I can move that window of spike time independent plasticity in different places around the network by changing the center of the rotation and also the distance of rotation from that part of the network. So it's rotating traveling waves are a really great way to organize spike time independent plasticity in LTP.
All right, excellent. So I think it's 30 past the hour here. So if there are any final pressing, desperate questions, wave your hands.
Well, they're all desperate questions.
Or that will solve your PhD problems and wrap things up. But no, but in all seriousness, I will edit out the things that we don't want in there and post it later. But thanks, Earl, for sharing your thoughts, and certainly a lot of cool things we're looking forward in the future, because really a lot of redirecting of neuroscience in general that is needed to take these ideas further. So we look forward to seeing that and seeing how the neuroscience community is going to react and yeah, and looking forward to it. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Really,
All right.
thanks a lot.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Earl.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.